This is Audible.
Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, The Life and Legacy of Nazi Germany's Most Popular Commander, by Charles River Editors, narrated by Colin Fluxman. Introduction. A soldier's first duty is to obey, otherwise you might as well do away with soldiering. Kesselring. Albert Kesselring holds a strange place in the history of World War II. A commander in the Luftwaffe, he is remembered as much for the skill with which he oversaw the German allies as for his mastery of the air fleets. Called Uncle Albert by many of his men, and Smiling Albert by the Allies, he was widely respected by men on both sides of the war, and loved by many of his troops. Yet he was responsible for massacres in occupied Italy, for which he was condemned to death during the post-war trials. Ultimately, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, making him one of the few top Nazi leaders to pen memoirs after the war. But it goes without saying that Kesselring's time was marked by controversy. Kesselring had the skills of a politician and a diplomat, as well as those of a soldier, which carried his career through both World War I and World War II, and during the Second World War he served in almost every theatre of the fighting in Europe. He was undoubtedly a gifted commander, but one who served at a time when the German military was tainted with the evils of Nazism. Who was Albert Kesselring, and what made the seemingly contradictory man tick? Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, The Life and Legacy of Nazi Germany's Most Popular Commander, analyzes the life and career of the controversial military leader. Early years. Rosina Kesselring gave birth to a baby boy on the 30th of November 1885 in the Bavarian town of Markstedt. The Kesselrings were a family of middling status in the local area. Though the extended family included small-time landowners and farmers, it also included professionals, such as the relatives who ran a brewery, and Rosina's husband, Karl Adolf Kesselring, a teacher and town councillor. Albert spent his early years in Markstedt, roaming the lands of his extended family, learning about the countryside, and developing a strong sense of self-reliance. He attended the Christian Ernestinum Secondary School in Bayreuth, completing his studies in 1904. At the dawn of the 20th century, military careers held great prestige in Germany. The nation had been united in 1870 through a series of successful wars led by militaristic Prussia, and so the army was particularly important to the sense of German identity. The Bavarian forces held a distinctive place within the German army as an independent force working with the rest of Germany, and Albert had a strong sense of his place within his long historic tradition. In his memoir, A Soldier to the Last Day, he described how his forefathers had defended Teutonic Christian lands against Magyar and Slav invasions as far back as the 12th century, an example to which he aspired. As the son of a schoolmaster, Kesselring didn't have an easy route into the military hierarchy. The German military was run by an officer aristocracy, with preference going to the sons of officers, and those who didn't come from a military background had to work that much harder to earn their place. But Albert was willing to put in that work, and after finishing his schooling, he joined the 2nd Bavarian Foot Artillery Regiment, which wasn't considered a prestigious unit, as it lacked the glamour of the horse or field artillery. The main duties consisted of maintaining the forts around Metz. Through study and service, Kesselring began to rise through the ranks, attending the military academy from 1905 to 1906, the artillery academy from 1909 to 1910, being promoted from ensign to lieutenant in 1907, and completing training as a balloon observer, a role involving gathering intelligence and directing artillery fire from a dirigible floating above the battle lines in 1912. He had taken an interest in the more technical side of war, and the School of Artillery and Engineering considered taking him on as an instructor to make use of his knowledge of the connections between technology and tactics. During this time, Kesselring's life wasn't all about study of the military. In 1910 he married Louise Anna Pauline Keisler, a young woman from Bayreuth. Though they never had children of their own, they adopted a boy named Rainer, the son of Kesselring's second cousin, in 1913. As the Kesselring settled down to raise their son, storm clouds were gathering over Europe, and long-held tensions were about to erupt, bringing the continent to war. World War I. The outbreak of the First World War at the end of July 1914 was a turning point for all of Europe. For the next 4 years, the continent was engulfed in a multi-fronted campaign that would cost millions of lives and change the way wars were fought. Kesselring played his part in the war, but it wasn't a particularly prominent or glamorous one. He continued to serve with the foot artillery for the first 3 years, initially with his original regiment, then with the 1st Bavarian Foot Artillery, and then with the 3rd Bavarian Foot Artillery. They were placed on the Western Front in the largely immobile standoff that was the war Germany waged against the British and French. Artillery played an important part on the Western Front, as it was used to soften enemies up before attacks and to provide support for the infantry. Men such as Kesselring helped create the shattered landscape of shell holes and ruined buildings at which the armies stared from their trenches, but the artillery was rarely able to soften enemy lines enough to make advances possible. In May 1916, Kesselring was promoted to the rank of captain. His actions at the Battle of Arras helped to halt a British advance, and he earned the Iron Cross, 2nd Class, and the Iron Cross, 1st Class, for his work as an artillery officer on the Western Front. In 1917, Kesselring was promoted to the German General Staff, which was unusual, given that he had not completed a training course at the Bavarian War Academy, the usual route for Bavarian officers to reach such a post. The promotion made clear that something about Kesselring had clearly impressed his superiors. As a staff officer, Kesselring was sent to the Eastern Front, where he was part of the 1st Bavarian Landwehr Division, one of the official armies of national defense, rather than one of the regular line forces the Germans called up, as their resources had become strained. Moreover, the fighting on the Eastern Front didn't last long after Kesselring's arrival. A series of revolutions in Russia plunged the country into civil war, and the Bolsheviks, the party that initially gained prominence, would eventually win control of the country, opposed Russia's continued involvement in the war. They sued for peace, thus ending the fighting on the Eastern Front. Germany rushed to send troops from east to west, and Kesselring was among them, serving as a staff officer with the 2nd and 3rd Bavarian Corps. Kesselring's clear organizational and tactical abilities had seen his career prospects improve during the war, but for Germany the prospects were grim. The flood of troops to the Western Front was counterbalanced by the arrival of the Americans, and after the spring offensives of 1918 failed to break through the Allied lines, the German army was driven back, its economy crippled, its government in turmoil, and its armies in retreat. Germany sued for peace, leading to an armistice in November of that year. The end of the war proved to be a difficult time for Kesselring. He returned his unit to its base in Nuremberg in good order, despite the political and social chaos around them. But in late 1918, when he asked to leave the army, his request was refused. The German military still had use for him, asking him to stay on to help with demobilization. In the immediate aftermath of the war, even as the Treaty of Versailles aimed to defang Germany, the Russian Civil War caused chaos in the east, and Polish insurgents infringed on German lands there. Under the terms of the armistice, the Germans were not allowed to use regular troops to defend these lands. Kesselring helped to raise volunteer forces, used against Polish incursions and communist attempts to sow revolution in Germany. But Germany was a hotbed of plots, protests, and would-be revolts. It was not a healthy place for anyone to work, especially not for someone holding a position of responsibility. Kesselring's main job was to demobilize the 3rd Bavarian Corps based around Nuremberg, but he got into trouble due to a disagreement with a leader in the local Freikorps, the volunteer units raised to defend Germany. This led to Kesselring's arrest for allegedly having planned a coup against the leadership of his corps. No charges were ever brought against him, and he was soon released, albeit with a censure from his superior for demonstrating a lack of discretion. Between the wars. At 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, the war to end all wars had finally come to an end. The armistice brought about the cessation of all offensive activities in Europe, and the points detailed in the text of the armistice itself were mainly decided by Marshal Foch. Though based upon Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, what they meant in brief was a complete and utter defeat for Germany. All military hostilities were to cease immediately within 6 hours, and Germany would withdraw all remaining troops from France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Alsace-Lorraine within 2 weeks. The Germans would also be obliged to pull back from their positions in Turkey, Romania, and Austro-Hungary and resume the 1914 borderline. Likewise, they would have to withdraw all forces on the western front to the Rhine and submit to Allied occupation of a buffer zone. The German Navy would also be confined to port, and all its submarines surrendered to the Allies, along with 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 3,000 mortars, 1,700 airplanes, 5,000 train locomotives, and 150,000 train cars. As the terms suggest, there was no sympathy for the Germans, either in the armistice terms or in those of the peace that followed. Likewise, public opinion, and that of the troops who had fought so hard and for so long, was strongly in favor of making examples out of the Germans. Millions had died, France and Belgium had been devastated, and Russia had been plunged into bloody revolution, and it was firmly believed that the Germans had been responsible for all of it, and thus deserved everything they got. Accordingly, the Allies kept firing upon the German positions right until the very last possible second before the armistice came into effect. What followed World War I in the shell-shocked vacuum of a war-ravaged Germany is well known, and the merits of meting out such a ruthless punishment on the losers, and the resentment and hatred this fostered within the German population, has been debated at length. That said, it is difficult not to sympathize with the decision-makers who forced the terms of surrender down the Kaiser's throat after seeing millions of their young men march off to fight and die against what they saw as unrepentant German aggression. The peace process was always bound to be an emotional issue, particularly for the French and Belgians at the table, who had seen huge swaths of their countries turned into barren, shell-blasted wastelands by 4 years of warfare. Still, some of the veterans at the time presumed the Great War would not be the war to end all wars. Indeed, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch himself prophetically asserted, "This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years." As a result, the combination of military and economic collapse at the end of the war left Germany subject to widespread economic pain and violent social conflict, the kind of conditions that led to revolutions, much like the one that had swept up Russia in 1917. Political parties also flourished in the post-war years. The Social Democrats and the Centre Party were the most rational of these, and they largely sought to create a stable republic amid the era's ongoing chaos and economic shocks. Dedicated to a peaceful and law-abiding cultural and political outlook, however, they found it difficult to rein in the other parties and factions which had no such scruples. The German Communist Party, or KDP, remained in force, even after the Spartacists, though its star was on the wane, and it never mustered enough Reichstag seats to counter the other parties' agendas. Looming behind all the other factions and parties was the Reichswehr, the German army. Though nominally reduced to an active strength of 100,000 men by the treaties that ended World War I, millions of ex-soldiers still identified closely with it, and thought of themselves as military men first and foremost, giving it tremendous power. Led by a fiercely monarchist and ultra-conservative officer corps, the army was also the main wielder of legally sanctioned armed force in Germany, making it an ally worth cultivating by any politician or demagogue seeking real, lasting power. The soldiery also represented an excellent recruiting pool for any right-wing faction or leader who claimed the restoration of Germany's strength and glory as a primary objective. Throughout all of this, the overarching problem for the Weimar Republic was the economy. The interplay of three factors, war reparations, taxes, and inflation, created a deadly puzzle from which the government ultimately proved unable to extract itself in time. War reparations demanded large amounts of money, but raising taxes infuriated all levels of society to the point of a real threat to oust the current government. The combination dealt a serious blow to the tenuous efforts at recovery made by the prostrate German economy. Initially, the government's solution was to print vast quantities of money, which removed the need to raise taxes, but also led to runaway hyperinflation. A moderate level of inflation would have been constructive, providing the growth capital needed for a modern economy to diversify, create new industries, and generate high-paying jobs. But the inflation rose far beyond this optimal level. That said, the policies did result in a rapid reindustrialization of Germany, which would prove highly useful to Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s, even as one economic catastrophe after another came during the 1920s. The treaty had set strict limits on the German armed forces' size and scope, banning their use of certain technologies which had emerged during the war. They were also denied a general staff, the group of officers responsible for overseeing the army, developing its theoretical understanding, and setting out its logistical and strategic plans. As a result, one obvious response to the Versailles limitations was to work on rearmament in secret. A general staff soon existed again in everything but name. Using the innocuous title of the Truppenamt, troop office, it became a powerful faction within the military work on rearmament within the limits imposed by the Allies. The group, however, did not pursue a wider political agenda within Germany, as the Nazis would when they called for rearmament. Rather, these professional soldiers were concerned solely with military might. In the meantime, the cutbacks to the armed forces cost many officers their jobs, but not Kesselring, who became a battery commander with the 24th Artillery Regiment in 1919. The German armed forces had been reduced from 4.5 million men to a mere 100,000. Retaining only the best men, yet Kesselring held the post for 3 years, reflecting his capability as a commander. In 1922, Kesselring joined the staff of the Reichswehr Ministry, the military of the post-Versailles Germany, imbued with the ethics of its officer aristocracy, as a major. Though officially a servant of the Weimar Republic, which had replaced the German monarchy at the end of the First World War, the Reichswehr did its best to ignore the government. Its main concern remained bolstering Germany's military strength to what it once had been. Over the next 7 years, Kesselring's work touched on almost every aspect of the Reichswehr. He helped in a range of administrative functions, including organization, training, and weaponry, and he co-wrote a well-received report on the Reichswehr for a general staff. At times, he was effectively Chief of Staff to Hans von Sicht, the Chief of the Army Command. Though Germany appeared to be fulfilling its obligations under the Treaty of Versailles, in reality the Reichswehr was doing everything it could to get around the treaty. They might not have been a general staff on paper, but in practice the officers of the ministry fulfilled that role. Banned from developing tanks and the tactics to use them, the Germans made an agreement with the Swedes and the Soviet Union to covertly develop this technology. In 1922, Germany and Russia signed the Treaty of Rapallo. In public, the two nations were simply normalizing relations and giving up claims on each other's territories, but in secret they began cooperating on developing their militaries. The Germans had been banned from having an air force or tank formations, but in secret maneuvers in Russia, they began to develop the exact same technologies and training the men to use them. Kesselring was among the officers who took part in covert maneuvers in the USSR in 1924, maneuvers that played a part in developing Germany's hard-hitting tank formations in World War II. In 1929, Kesselring returned to his native Bavaria as the commander of the military district around Munich. He then briefly went back to work in the Reichswehr Ministry, was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1930, and joined the 4th Artillery Regiment, where he served for 2 years. In 1933, everything changed for Germany and for Kesselring as well. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party had been gaining political ground through an agenda built on the bitterness of the Versailles Treaty and the hatred of groups they believed had made Germany weak. And through a combination of political campaigning and street violence, they rose to become a powerful force. In 1933, the Nazis became the largest party in the government, and Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, a position he eventually used to take complete control of the country, with himself in the position of dictator. Rearmament was central to Hitler's political agenda. The restricted Reichswehr was renamed as the Wehrmacht, a larger, prouder, unrestrained collection of armed forces. As a part of this move, Hitler introduced conscription and announced the existence of an air force, two moves which broke the Treaty of Versailles and ended the illusion that Germany was still adhering to the treaty's terms. It was a provocative move, but one that was begrudgingly accepted by the international community. World War I was far behind them, the fear of German aggression fading into the past, but it would not take long for the irony of this attitude to be revealed. The expansion of the military was good news for the German officer corps, but it was also a source of division. Hitler brought fresh blood into the armed forces, ideologically motivating Nazis who agreed with the party's other policies, some of which were too radical for old-style conservative commanders. The SS became a paramilitary organization outside the army, a party-controlled force with which the Wehrmacht had no choice but to cooperate, and in which traditionalist career soldiers came into conflict with rising party men. Kesselring was transferred to the Luftwaffe in October 1933, but initially he resisted the move, wanting to remain in the army. In response, the Army Chief of Staff reminded him of his duty as a soldier to do as he was told, and that was a good enough reason for Kesselring to accept the position. As a colonel in a senior administrative post, Kesselring set about building up Germany's secret air force. Air units were absorbed from the army and navy, and alliances were made with engineers and industrialists, leading to hidden factories and research into better planes. Kesselring built up his own staff, acquired the land needed for airfields and barracks, and oversaw the expansion of this newly created organization under the supervision of Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's leading lieutenants. Knowing he'd never be a match for the professional airman, Kesselring took his job very seriously and learned how to fly, believing it vital that he understood their work. Kesselring's efforts quickly brought further promotions, as he became a Major General in March 1935, and then Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff in 1936. In his new role, Kesselring oversaw the expansion of the Luftwaffe and the development of new techniques, including spending a lot of time developing the Luftwaffe's paratroops arm, a force that would play a tactically important role in several campaigns during World War II. He also oversaw the acquisition of new planes, including the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, two of the most famous German planes of the coming war. The acquisition of the Stuka reflected Kesselring's attitude toward the role of air power in warfare. Having come out of the army, Kesselring saw the Luftwaffe's main purpose as a tactical one, providing air support for land operations. And the Stuka was an ideal plane for this purpose, as it was able to take out artillery positions and armored vehicles standing in the army's way. It was this sort of work that earned the Stuka its fearsome reputation in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The testing ground for the Stuka was the Spanish Civil War. Upon taking over as Chief of Staff, one of Kesselring's first acts was to suggest German planes be sent there to test their capability in combat, a move that would help win the war for General Francisco Franco's right-wing regime. It also gave German pilots and bomber crews useful experience for the wars that were to come. Despite his successes, Kesselring found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position, clashing with General Erhard Milch, the Secretary of State for Air, which got in the way of his work. Kesselring asked to either leave the service or to be transferred, but rather than lose one of his best officers and administrators, Göring moved Kesselring to Luftflotte 3, Air Fleet 3, based in Dresden. While Kesselring was at Luftflotte 3, tensions rose between Germany and Czechoslovakia as Hitler tried to lay claim to part of the neighboring country. Kesselring had airfields built close to the border, ready to deal with Czech and French planes if war came, and he also made plans for aggressive airstrikes against the Czechs. In the end, his plans proved unnecessary. The rest of Europe backed down, which allowed Hitler to take the land he wanted in the autumn of 1938, postponing the war. On the 1st of October, Kesselring was promoted to Air General and Commander of Luftflotte 1, based in Berlin. Tensions were once again on the rise in Europe as Nazi aggression all but ensured war would return, and Kesselring set about preparing his forces for that war. The start of World War II. Results will demonstrate an officer's fitness to be a field marshal, and no one will then ask about his origins, whether he came from the army or the air force. But one piece of advice I will give to all airfield marshals: do not become a one-sided technician, but learn to think and lead in terms of all three services. Kesselring. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland in a carefully planned operation designed to overwhelm their Polish opponents. The Wehrmacht adopted a very bold, large-scale strategy, using two huge encircling movements to chop Polish territory into thirds. Army Group North, starting from East Prussia and northern Germany, launched two main thrusts southeast, while Army Group South, based in Germany and Czechoslovakia, launched two thrusts northwest. The Germans intended these pincer movements to converge at Warsaw and Brest-Litovsk, thereby cutting off and encircling vast numbers of Polish soldiers who would be compelled to surrender or be annihilated. Within days, Britain and France declared war on Germany in support of their Polish allies, but meanwhile the Soviet Union prepared to occupy half of Poland under a secret treaty made with Hitler. Luftwaffe 1 provided air support for German forces invading Poland. Kesselring took his role as commander of the air fleet very seriously, considering himself to be under the unofficial command of General Fedor von Bock, the commander of Army Group North, in everything relating to the war on the ground. Army Group North consisted of 630,000 German soldiers in total, while Army Group South, the larger of the two, in part because of its broader and more accessible staging area in Czechoslovakia and Germany, numbered 882,000 soldiers. Against the full weight of approximately 1.5 million men, the Poles mustered somewhere between 900,000 and 1.2 million, though 900,000 is likely closer to the mark. 446,000 Soviet troops lurked east of the Polish border as well, awaiting the opportune moment to strike. Germany's army was far more mechanized than Poland's. Besides tanks and armored cars, a fleet of heavy trucks offered rapid transport of men and material. Half-tracks moved artillery and ammunition to places where they were needed, and thousands of motorcycles with sidecars provided messenger service, scouting, and rapid deployment of machine gun teams. Statistics demonstrated the stark difference in mechanization between the opponents. 10% of the Polish army consisted of cavalry, while only 2% of the Wehrmacht was cavalry in 1939, a figure that was steadily shrinking too. Though a lack of fuel eventually provided the Achilles heel for German armies later in the war, this was not an issue during the Polish campaign of 1939. The balance of power in the air was also in favor of the Germans. While the Polish Air Force was able to field 842 planes, the Germans had 4,700. The best Polish fighter, the PZL P-11, had a maximum speed of 240 miles per hour, while the German Messerschmitt Bf-109E was able to reach speeds of 350 miles per hour. Though the Polish pilots managed to destroy 126 Luftwaffe planes in the course of the war, they were swiftly overwhelmed, leaving the Germans in control of the skies. Kesselring focused on providing excellent air support for the ground forces, and this air superiority provided him the opportunity to concentrate his forces in decisive strikes against Polish ground troops. During the Battle of the Basra, he supported the ground troops in their attack against Polish positions. When the Poles began moving back, he launched the largest air operation of the campaign, which saw the Luftwaffe pound the retreating Polish army. As the Germans advanced, Kesselring switched to more strategic bombing, including a series of air attacks on Warsaw, in which he tried to cut off Polish lines of communication and limit the enemy's ability to maneuver. Kesselring wasn't content to sit behind the lines and send orders to distant troops. He insisted on being close to the front, traveling to aerodromes to welcome flyers when they got back from their raids. It was the sort of behavior that made him popular with his men, earning him the nickname of Uncle Albert. It was also the sort of behavior that put his life at risk. During the campaign, the Polish Air Force shot his plane down during one of his flights over Poland, the first of 5 times he would be shot down over the course of the war. But Kesselring survived, and for his role in the conquest of Poland he was awarded the prestigious Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. After the fall of Poland, Kesselring was initially left with the job of organizing air defenses in Poland in preparation for possible Allied raids. But an incident occurred on the far side of Europe in January 1940 that would see Kesselring called to more immediate action. On the 10th of that month, a German plane crash-landed in neutral Belgium, and on board was an officer carrying details of the planned German invasion of France through Belgium and the Netherlands. The incident was a setback for the Germans, who hastily redrew their plans for the offensive. It was also a huge embarrassment for Göring, as the failures of one of his officers had led to Allied capture of these vital documents. Göring immediately sacked General Helmut Felmy, the man in charge of Luftwaffe II, under whose leadership the incident had taken place. It was important that someone more reliable be put in charge of upcoming operations against France and Britain, and that man would be Kesselring, who arrived at his new post in mid-January 1940. There he found a familiar face, General von Bock, with whom he had worked in Poland, who was in command of Army Group B, and with whom Luftwaffe II would be most closely collaborating. For the next few months, Kesselring worked on getting his new Luftwaffe ready for the operations ahead, carrying out conferences with his officers, inspecting the units under his command, overseeing the training of the men, and ordering rehearsals of the movements his units would undertake, exactly the sort of diligent work that had become his hallmark. The Germans launched their attack on the 10th of May, pouring into the Low Countries, and Kesselring's first task was to support the invasion of the Netherlands, providing von Bock's troops with close air support as they advanced. Though there had not been time to soften up the Royal Netherlands Air Force before the attack, the Germans soon gained the advantage in the air, thanks to their advanced machines, experienced pilots, and weight of numbers. 4 days later, German troops were facing stiff opposition in Rotterdam, and Luftwaffe II was called upon to provide air support for their attack, break the back of Dutch resistance, and ensure the swift fall of the city. Kesselring sent in the bombers, but the situation on the ground was complex. General Arthur Schmidt, the German commander, was simultaneously planning a complex assault while negotiating with his Dutch counterpart, trying to bring about a surrender. As the bombers approached, the threat of a bombing raid was postponed, and a signal was sent to abort the raid, but the message didn't get through to all of the German bombers, and a part of the attack took place in which 900 people were killed, thousands were left homeless, and the medieval heart of the city was ruined. Fires blazed for days, sweeping through Rotterdam. Despite the events in Rotterdam, the invasion was going well. Once the Dutch surrendered, Luftwaffe II was reassigned to support German forces in Belgium and France, where they achieved incredible success in breaking through French lines near the Ardennes forest, sweeping up through the country, and cutting the Allied forces in two by reaching the coast. After only 2 weeks, the British Expeditionary Force, along with many French troops, were about to be isolated around the port of Dunkirk. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud announced the desperate situation to the French Senate in Paris on May 22, 1940, producing deep shock. Most government officials of France believed up to that moment in an imminent Allied victory. The Secretary of War, Marshal Pétain, later head of the collaborationist Vichy government, argued for an armistice. Nevertheless, Weygand remained confident, albeit for reasons that might have been comical if not for the situation's deadly seriousness. As Sir Alistair Horn noted, despite his arduous experiences of the past 24 hours, the 73-year-old Generalissimo arrived full of bounce and launched into his analysis of the situation on an evident note of optimism. "So many mistakes have been made," he began, "that they give me confidence. I believe that in future we shall make less." Weygand outlined a plan of bizarre optimism in which the entire trapped Allied force would turn south and round up the panzers in the course of 1 day. In the meantime, the Germans established numerous bridgeheads on the south bank of the Somme to be used when the southward advance began. Panzers invested Boulogne on May 22nd, and on May 23rd the British evacuated their troops at midnight. The French garrison surrendered at noon 2 days later on May 25th, recognizing their utterly hopeless position. As the Allies stood trapped around Dunkirk, Göring asked Hitler to hold the army back and let the Luftwaffe finish the British off. Nervous about his forces being overextended, Hitler agreed, against the advice of the army commanders and Kesselring. The British government ordered an evacuation of Dunkirk on May 26th, but the BEF and the French forces accompanying them could not escape that easily, however. Near catastrophe struck on May 28th when the Belgians surrendered to Germany, opening a colossal gap in the Allied lines. King Leopold III, showing consistency of character, at least if not moral courage, informed the British and French of his planned capitulation only hours prior to the actual surrender, leaving them with practically no time to prepare for its disastrous military consequences. The action earned Leopold III such sobriquets as King Rat and the Traitor King, nicknames he did little to disprove when he evinced more willingness to negotiate with Hitler for restoration of Belgian independence than he had shown in dealing with France and Britain, which sought to defend Belgium's freedom in the first place. British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill blasted the Belgian monarch's abrupt surrender in a detailed speech summarizing the repercussions. The surrender of the Belgian army compelled the British at the shortest notice to cover a flank to the sea more than 30 miles in length. Otherwise all would have been cut off, and all would have shared the fate to which King Leopold had condemned the finest army his country had ever formed. So, in doing this, and in exposing this flank, as anyone who followed the operations on the map will see, contact was lost between the British and 2 out of 3 corps forming the First French Army. On the 25th of May, Kesselring's Luftwaffe began raining bombs down on the isolated Allied forces, which proved to be a mistake. The Luftwaffe was impressive, but air power alone could not destroy the Allied troops, and the British were able to evacuate most of their men, while the German army held back. Hitler, distracted by prospects of moving south through largely undefended French territory, realized too late that Göring's decision stemmed from emotion, not military logic. The British fought off the Luftwaffe, aided by foul weather which impeded the German pilots. The Channel port also lay within striking distance of airstrips in southern England, allowing British fighters to support the isolated troops. Overall, 98,671 men evacuated from Dunkirk via the beaches, and 239,555 evacuated from the harbour, of whom some 200,000 escaped via the 2 huge concrete breakwaters or moles which the German bombing could not damage. 338,226 men in all evacuated by sea from Dunkirk, with the rearguard of 40,000, all French, surrendering on June 4, 1940. With them went any chance of defeating the Nazi invasion of France in 1940, but they carried the seeds of hope with them and the promise of a future return. Meanwhile, Kesselring informed High Command that his forces had been left tired and weakened by the campaign thus far, but his protests were ignored because air cover was still needed elsewhere on the front, so he made fresh plans to send his men into the Battle of France. Fortunately for Luftwaffe too, the French had also been badly weakened, and the fighting ended on the 25th of June. Following the fall of France, Hitler took on a 2-pronged approach for dealing with Britain, the only major power still opposing him. On the one hand, he appealed to the British to make peace, an appeal that was soundly rejected by Prime Minister Winston Churchill's government. On the other hand, he prepared for an invasion of the United Kingdom, a plan titled Operation Sea Lion. Kesselring's preparations for Sea Lion began with information gathering. He set up a system of masts to intercept radio messages between RAF pilots and the ground, so that the Luftwaffe would be better informed about what the British were doing, followed by a series of raids against British shipping, which saw German and British pilots fighting over the Channel. In July, Göring went to visit Kesselring to tell him the Luftwaffe was being given the job of destroying Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, so that invasion forces could be safely shipped across the Channel. Kesselring and Sperler, the commander of Luftwaffe III, opposed Göring's tactics, believing that sending in bombers before the fighters of RAF Fighter Command had been dealt with would lead to heavy and needless losses. They pointed out that about 700 of their planes were currently ready for operations, as opposed to the 4,500 Göring expected, having recognized the Luftwaffe had not invested heavily enough in long-range bombers for such an operation. In the end, Göring could not be persuaded. The Luftwaffe chief wanted his victory, Hitler wanted his invasion, and in August 1940 the Battle of Britain began. The air war over Britain played out much as Kesselring anticipated. From the first day, bombers were lost due to inadequate fighter cover, and though the effort of defending their country strained the RAF to its limits, it did not break, In September, the focus of the fighting shifted from hammering military targets to strategic bombing of cities and raids, meant merely to instill terror, and the RAF gained the respite needed. Around the 15th of September, the balance shifted, and it became clear the Luftwaffe would not win over the skies of Britain. Even as this happened, Hitler was having a change of heart. As poor weather led to the postponement of Sea Lion, the Führer decided to start planning for operations against the Soviet Union. Kesselring and the increasingly battered Luftwaffe II continued to hammer away at Britain, despite the fact the strategic goal had been abandoned. Kesselring would later assert Allied air power was the greatest single reason for the German defeat. Kesselring referred to the Battle of Britain as a bitter period, and in his opinion, his forces had been wasted in attacks against too many different objectives, which ensured failure. As the attacks on Britain wound down, Göring cast blame on the fighter wing for not providing enough support, but Kesselring's view of the situation was very different. To him, it had been a disaster from the top down. Operation Barbarossa. During the Christmas season in 1940, Kesselring took some time off and returned to Germany, but while he was able to leave his command behind, he couldn't stop thinking like a commander. In Germany, he saw the difference between life on the front lines and that in the heart of the Reich. He saw that air defenses were chaotic and far from adequate to defend his homeland against Allied air raids, so he ordered improvements be made to German air defenses. However, work on those improvements remained slow, and when he returned to Warsaw in early 1941, he was disappointed to see the changes remained incomplete. They would not be in place before Hitler launched his next campaign, the one that likely determined the outcome of the war. Hitler's new plan was Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion of Soviet Russia, which had signed a non-aggression pact with the Germans a few years earlier. The Germans would be supported by other countries that resented the Soviets, but ultimately the German troops would do the vast majority of the fighting. Naturally, this called for air support, and Luftwaffe II was moved east, along with many other German units, in preparation for the invasion. Kesselring's forces would have two roles in the campaign. First, they would destroy Soviet planes on the ground, ensuring air superiority for the Luftwaffe, and second, they would support an army group in its advances, led once again by von Bock. Luftwaffe II's eastern departure was delayed until May 1941, partly while they waited for air bases to be built in Poland, and partly as a measure of deception that aimed to hide what the Germans were about to do. As the Luftwaffe arrived in the east, Kesselring traveled from base to base, inspecting his units in the field. He found they still had far too few aircraft to fulfill Göring's goals, and he worried his work was doomed from the start. Kesselring appealed to Göring for more aircraft, but Göring repeatedly rejected his requests, saying that other Luftwaffe commanders had also asked for more planes, and that Kesselring would have to make do with what he'd been given. Kesselring pressed his point, but to no avail. By the 15th of June, Luftwaffe II had finished assembling in the east. In the final week before the launch of Barbarossa, Kesselring returned to touring his troops' bases, carrying out inspections of the men and conferences with his officers, and assembling a special squadron of planes whose crews had been trained for combat at night. He might not have liked the task given to him, but he was determined to do the best he could to complete it. In the warm pre-dawn darkness of June 22, 1941, 3 million men waited along a front hundreds of miles long, stretching from the Baltic coast of Poland to the Balkans. Ahead of them in the darkness lay the Soviet Union, its border guarded by millions of Red Army troops, echeloned deep throughout the huge spaces of Russia. This massive gathering of Wehrmacht soldiers from Adolf Hitler's Third Reich and his allied states, notably Hungary and Romania, stood poised to carry out Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's surprise attack against the country of his putative ally, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. At precisely 1 a.m. that morning, the radios of command and headquarter units all along the line crackled to life. Officers and generals heard a single code word, Dortmund for Army Group North, and Wotan, the name of the one-eyed pre-Christian god of knowledge, war, and ruins, for Army Group South. In answer to shouted orders and tactical-level radio transmissions, men threw aside camouflage nets. Truck, half-track, and panzer engines started with a throbbing rumble, and artillerists prepared their weaponry for the terrific barrage, generally preceding a Wehrmacht assault. Soldiers swarmed onto trains, and the propellers of thousands of German aircraft, including the still formidable Stuka dive bombers, roared amid the nighttime stillness on dozens of airfields throughout Eastern Europe. Though Germany was technically Russia's ally, Stalin had no delusions that they were friends. Instead, he used this time to build up his forces for what he saw as an inevitable invasion. First, on the heels of the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, Stalin had his troops invade and reclaim the land Russia had lost in World War I. Next, he turned his attention to Finland, which was only 100 miles from the newly named Leningrad. He initially tried to negotiate with the Finnish government for some sort of treaty of mutual support. When this failed, he simply invaded. While the giant Russian army ultimately won, the fact that little Finland held them off for 3 months demonstrated how poorly organized the bigger force was. Initially, Stalin believed he had several years to build up his army before Germany would invade, figuring it would at least take the Germans that long to conquer France and Britain. However, when France fell quickly in 1940, it seemed he might have miscalculated, so he again sent Molotov to Berlin to stall for time. Meanwhile, Hitler trained his sights on Britain, turning his attention to destroying the Royal Air Force as a prerequisite for the invasion of Britain. The British were able to prevent a German invasion thanks to the Battle of Britain in late 1940, and Stalin knew that if he could delay an invasion through the summer of 1941, he would be safe for another year. Unfortunately for Stalin, Molotov's mission to Berlin failed, and Hitler began to plan to invade Russia by May of 1941. Since military secrets are typically the hardest to keep, Stalin soon began to hear rumors of the invasion. But even when Winston Churchill contacted him in April 1941, warning him that German troops seemed to be massing on Russia's border, Stalin remained dubious. Stalin felt even more secure in his position when the Germans failed to invade the following May. What Stalin did not realize was that Hitler had simply overstretched himself in Yugoslavia, and only planned to delay the invasion by a few weeks. Hitler aimed to destroy Stalin's communist regime, but he also hoped to gain access to resources in Russia, particularly oil. Throughout the first half of 1941, Germany dug in to safeguard against an Allied invasion of Western Europe as it began to mobilize millions of troops to invade the Soviet Union. Stalin even refused to believe the report of a German defector who claimed that the troops were massing on the Soviet border at that very moment. The Soviets were so caught by surprise at the start of the attack that the Germans were able to push several hundred miles into Russia across a front that stretched dozens of miles long, reaching the major cities of Leningrad and Sevastopol in just 3 months. The first major Russian city in their path was Minsk, which fell in only 6 days. In order to make clear his determination to win at all costs, Stalin had the 3 men in charge of the troops defending Minsk executed for their failure to hold their position. This move, along with unspeakable atrocities by the German soldiers against the people of Minsk, solidified the Soviet will. In the future, Russian soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender, and in July, Stalin exhorted the nation, "It is time to finish retreating. Not one step back. Such should now be our main slogan. Henceforth, the solid law of discipline for each commander, Red Army soldier, and commissar should be the requirement. Not a single step back without order from higher command." Though the attack caught Stalin utterly by surprise, the tension between the two violent, predatory states made such a clash almost inevitable. The USSR had no plans to invade Germany in 1941, but it had remained an aggressive military state, infused with a savage zeal to abolish all borders into one international workers' paradise through force of arms, as Vladimir Lenin and many other Soviet leaders and writers made clear. Bourgeois nationalism and proletarian internationalism, they are two irreconcilably hostile slogans. We say yes to any struggle against national oppression, for any struggle for any kind of national development. For national culture in general, we say unconditionally no. Hitler, for his part, wanted Lebensraum for the Germans, at the expense, of course, of the Slavs. and viewed the communist state as an existential threat to Europe itself. Driven by a mix of raw acquisitive ambition, ideology, and actual understanding of the Soviet Union's own minatory intent, the Führer launched a full-scale invasion. Likely with intentional malice, the declaration of war delivered by Gustav von Schulenburg several hours after the invasion's start mirrored almost exactly the Soviet pretext of defending their borders, used during the USSR's invasion of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland. In view of the intolerable further threats which have been created for the eastern German borders, as a consequence of the massed concentration and preparation of all the armed forces of the Red Army, the German government considers itself compelled immediately to take military countermeasures. Thus, Hitler had cast aside his uneasy, friction-laden alliance with the Soviet Union, striking it while the Red Army remained debilitated by Stalin's purges of the officer corps and his destruction of mobile tank doctrine as counter-revolutionary. In beginning the start of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the deadliest part of history's deadliest war, Operation Barbarossa would turn out to be arguably the most fateful choice of World War II. As the German troops advanced, Luftwaffe II took to the skies. Their first task was to destroy Soviet planes on the ground, but this created a problem for most of the pilots. The ground assault began at 03:30, an hour before dawn, but the pilots would not be able to hit their targets until the sun came up. During that hour, Kesselring's night-flying unit flew through the darkness to bomb selected airfields and attack Soviet planes before they were able to get off the ground, as he prepared them to do. As light touched the sky, the rest of Luftwaffe II joined the attack, first focusing on destroying the enemy aircraft before they could take off. The operation was a staggering success, and for the first few days they met no Soviet fighters in the air. This allowed the Luftwaffe to strike deep behind Soviet lines, hitting airfields and bases up to 200 miles beyond the fighting front. In the first week, Kesselring estimated his formations had destroyed 2,500 Soviet aircraft. Göring, who had underestimated both the number of planes the enemy had and the capability of his men, didn't believe the figures and insisted they weren't possible. But later checks revealed Kesselring had been right, and the true figure was at least as high as he had stated, if not higher. With enemy air power greatly reduced, Kesselring was free to focus on his other objective of supporting the ground forces. For Hitler's plan to work, the Germans needed to make swift, decisive advances as they had done in Poland and France, and air support was crucial for this, with bombers taking out defensive positions that might otherwise have held up the German advance. Luftwaffe II descended upon Soviet forces, facing the armored spearhead of the Army Group Center, focusing on protecting the flanks of advancing columns so as not to leave them exposed to counterattacks that might cut off the hardest-hitting and fastest-moving German forces. Having seen the value of air support, the Army regularly called upon the Luftwaffe for help. Having seen what had happened in Britain when too few planes had been spread across too many targets, Kesselring dissuaded them from spreading the impact of that air support too thinly. To achieve this, he concentrated on developing new tactics and encouraging the army to use them, like the idea of focusing air support at critical points where it would make the greatest difference. He appointed one of his colonels, Martin Fiebig, as a special commander responsible for close air support, and worked on improving coordination between the army and air units, bringing his experience in both fields to bear. Once again, Kesselring's thoughtfulness and focus paid off. When a month into the campaign, he was able to report that Luftwaffe II had destroyed 165 Soviet tanks, 194 artillery pieces, and 2,136 other vehicles. As summer turned to autumn, the weather worsened. Accompanied by Soviet persistence and Stalin's willingness to commit vast quantities of human resources to the fight, the German advance was slowed. In October, the Germans began one last big push to take Moscow, called Operation Typhoon, which called upon Luftwaffe II to provide air power for the attack. It was the most challenging operation Kesselring had ever faced, as Luftwaffe II was down to 549 working aircraft out of over 1,000 at the start of Operation Barbarossa. As the ground troops advanced, The planes began bombarding the city where they met tough Soviet air defenses. All-weather airstrips made it easier for the defenders to get fighters into the sky, and anti-aircraft guns wreaked havoc among the German planes, as they had done over Britain. Worsening weather made for poor flying conditions, leaving the Luftwaffe grounded at times. Kesselring's men served many functions during Operation Typhoon, including carrying out reconnaissance flights to assess the enemy's strength and disposition, giving close air support to advancing ground troops, as they had throughout Barbarossa, flying missions to bring in supplies, as German lines of communication became increasingly stretched, and tackling the Soviet Air Force, protecting troops on the ground from enemy air attacks. Still, anybody on the Russian front was able to see that the German advance had stalled. They had been throwing their resources against a tough and determined opponent, and the initial breakthroughs had not come. It must have come as a relief to both Kesselring and Luftwaffe 2's command staff when new orders arrived in November 1941 that they would no longer be fighting in Russia. Instead, they would be moving south to much sunnier weather, and what they could only hope would be safer operations. Supreme Commander South. As his command headed south, Kesselring's new post was that of Supreme Commander South. Based in Italy, he would oversee German operations in the Mediterranean, Balkans, and North Africa. Given the expansive nature of those duties, it was a role which would require all of Kesselring's skills, not just as a tactician, but as an administrator and a negotiator. He would also have to play the awkward role of diplomat added to his duties, as he sought to balance German and Italian interests in the region. The situation in the Mediterranean theatre was a difficult and complex one, as the Italians had decided to flex their muscles early in the war. Not wanting to play second fiddle to their German allies, the Italians launched invasions of Greece and of British-held Egypt. Around the same time, a coup in pro-Axis Yugoslavia had brought in a government that seemed likely to align itself with the Allies against Italy and Germany. The Italian invasions of Greece and Egypt both ended in disaster, as the Italian military, nowhere near as effective as the Germans, were driven back in both areas. Rather than allow the Axis to be embarrassed and outmaneuvered, Hitler sent German forces to assist the Italians by occupying Greece and Yugoslavia, where they became embroiled in a bitter campaign against partisan forces led by Marshal Tito. In Egypt, the arrival of the legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, and the Afrika Korps led to a revival of Axis fortunes. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean Sea itself, the route for supply lines between Italy and Africa, as well as for British shipping arriving from India and beyond through the Suez Canal, was a vital area of conflict. Control of the Mediterranean would allow one side to defend its own interests, and seriously hampered those of the enemy. Britain's Royal Navy was a dominating presence in the region, but it could be made vulnerable if deprived of supply bases. All of these issues fell under Kesselring's purview as Supreme Commander South. In addition to tackling the enemy, Kesselring had to manage the Italians. Their ineffectiveness had become a liability to the Germans, but they couldn't be treated as a subordinate power. They had sided with the British against the Germans during the First World War, and many Italian officers still felt the tug of that old allegiance. Though the Italian military worked for Mussolini, his power was not absolute, as Hitler's was in Germany. There was still a king in Italy, and the first allegiance of most Italians was to him. Put simply, if the Germans pushed in the wrong way, they risked losing their most important ally in Europe. Kesselring might have been relieved to be out of the Russian winter, but Italy was hardly a palace of delights. Given this environment, Kesselring effectively had to answer to both the high military commands of Germany and Italy. In theory at least, he had to work for the Italians, not just work on them, a situation which only added to the challenges facing him. His work was made no easier by the attitude of some in the German command. As happened in the past, Kesselring found them unwilling to listen to his most important ideas, even though he was closer to events on the ground than they were. One of Kesselring's first suggestions was an invasion of the island of Malta, a vital base for British air and sea forces in the Mediterranean. Taking it out would secure Axis supply lines while ruining those of the Allies, but his plan was rejected. Germany lacked the manpower for the invasion, and Hitler didn't trust the Italians not to mess it up. Similarly, when Kesselring raised concerns about potential Allied invasions of North Africa and Sicily, his views were dismissed by High Command, which remained convinced that if Allied forces arrived anywhere in the Mediterranean, it would be in the south of France. Kesselring's predictions would prove all too accurate, but the unwillingness of men in Berlin to accept that he might best understand his own theatre of operations was a constant hindrance. As theatre commander, Kesselring had control of forces on land, sea and air, using the wide variety of options available to him to try to ensure German and Italian supply lines. The level of losses with respect to Axis shipping was disturbingly high. Allied planes and submarines launched raids as they crossed the Mediterranean, and few convoys managed to complete the crossing without something being sunk. Kesselring focused on changing this, initially by gaining air superiority over the supply lines, which prevented Allied bombers from attacking Axis shipping and ensuring extra support against seaborne raiders. Soon, an increased volume of supplies was flowing across the sea to Rommel and the Afrika Korps, including fuel, which was vital to continuing a campaign dominated by battles between tanks. Kesselring had started to turn the Mediterranean around, and central to all of this was Malta, which provided a base for British submarines and planes, allowing the Allies to protect their own convoys and attack Axis ones. Kesselring's first step to eliminating this thorn in his side was to neutralize the heavily defended island as a base for attacks against Axis shipping. With the Germans and Italians controlling so much of the Mediterranean coast, the island had effectively been under siege since June 1940. Italian ships and planes had tried to cut it off from outside help and start the process of bombing the island into submission. After the British successfully fought back, the Italians were joined by German forces, and in every region where the Italians fought, Luftwaffe planes joined the battle for control of the skies. At first, the campaign to isolate Malta had been a moderate success, but in June 1941, a new British air commander arrived to turn the battle around, and that summer Malta went on the offensive. Resupplied with planes and other materials, the RAF and the Royal Navy launched a fresh assault on Axis shipping, halving the supplies getting through in the space of a month. When Kesselring arrived, he brought with him the Luftwaffe II, which he set to work tackling Allied air power. They shot down 20 Allied bombers and reconnaissance planes in the first 2 months, and the threat of their presence ended Allied air raids against convoys. After that, they would go on the offensive. Kesselring launched an air raid on Malta on New Year's Day 1942, the first in a series of attacks, putting the RAF on the defensive. Most attacks involved a sweep by fighters before the bombers arrived to support their safe passage over the island. They often focused their attacks on the British air bases in an effort to maintain their superiority in the skies, but the only way to permanently resolve the issue of Malta, thus giving Axis forces the supply advantage in North Africa, was an invasion. This time, Kesselring's proposal to invade the island was accepted, with Hitler and Mussolini agreeing to launch an airborne assault codenamed Operation Hercules in April 1942. Ultimately, however, Hitler got cold feet. The paratrooper invasion of Crete in the previous year had been a successful but costly one, making Hitler wary of another such operation. Rommel, for his part, recognized the value of Malta, but considered operations in Egypt to be a higher priority, and thus convinced Hitler to provide him with paratroopers as part of operations there. The invasion of Malta was postponed, much to Kesselring's annoyance. Kesselring hoped the issue would be revisited, but by the end of 1942 that hope was gone. British operations in autumn gave the Allies superiority around Malta again, bringing in more planes and doing enough damage to the Luftwaffe to end German control of the air. Events in Africa also forced Kesselring to direct his resources there. As 1943 dawned, the siege of Malta was over, and for all of Kesselring's efforts it had been a failure. Axis military efforts in North Africa were dominated by Rommel. Transferred to North Africa after having played an important role in the fall of France, Rommel found an Italian army at the mercy of the British. He brought with him German forces, and they went on the offensive, driving the British back and besieging the port of Tobruk. Rommel's achievements in North Africa brought him celebrity status, and his careful use of intelligence, bold maneuvers around enemy flanks, and a strong understanding of how best to use the potential of tanks all allowed him to drive the Allies back east and into Egypt in early 1941. To maintain his position, Rommel needed more troops, which weren't available because every spare man had been funneled into Operation Barbarossa. This eventually allowed the Allies to regain the initiative, forcing Rommel to move back so as to defend his troops and shorten his supply lines. With that, the potential for an invasion of Egypt was lost. When Kesselring took over command in the theatre, the chance for an Axis victory in North Africa still seemed to be in sight. The war had swayed back and forth, but the British hadn't gained a decisive edge. If the Germans and Italians were able to push forward, they might take Egypt, and with it the vital supply line through the Suez Canal. Kesselring worked with Rommel to provide the Afrika Korps with the supplies they needed, and they also worked out a plan for a fresh offensive against the Allies, resulting in Rommel's greatest victory, the Battle of Gazala, a fight in which Kesselring played an active part. Launched on the 26th of May, 1942, Gazala was a month-long battle during which German and Italian forces took on the British, Indians, South Africans, and Free French west of Tobruk, allowing the Axis forces to overrun Tobruk, drive the Allies back, and pursue them into Egypt. It was this pursuit that drew off the forces preparing to invade Malta. During the fighting, the Italian infantry of the 10 and 21st Corps were led by Ludwig Cruel. Their job was to hold up the British 8th Army while Rommel made a flanking maneuver. On the 29th of May, Cruel was captured, leaving the forces without a leader. Kesselring, who in characteristic style was visiting the troops at the front, was the only commander in the area with enough seniority to take Cruel's place, and for part of the battle, the commander for the entire Axis forces in the Mediterranean took command of a formation under Rommel. Later in the fighting at Gazala, Kesselring was shot at by Allied forces while flying to a meeting. Realizing the Allied troops were sitting on Rommel's communication lines, he called in an airstrike against them, and the British were forced back with heavy losses. Though Kesselring admired Rommel as a leader of men and believed he was a good commander at the corps level, he found him a difficult character with whom to work, and thus thought Rommel unsuitable for a position of high command due to his changing moods. Kesselring was the ultimate example of steady, stable leadership, as much an administrator as a source of inspiration, whereas Rommel was a flamboyant, frontline leader who had waded into rivers under fire to help his men build bridges in France. Their contrasting styles and Rommel's unwillingness to bow to Kesselring's more senior position made clashes between them inevitable. Though Gazala was a success, it was also a source of disagreement. Rommel's infantry assault on Bir Hakem initially failed to drive the French out of their position, despite the air support provided. Kesselring, long an expert in coordination between ground and air troops, blamed the setback on Rommel's failure to properly coordinate. The pursuit of the Allies into Egypt was also a source of disagreement. Rommel requested and was given the paratroopers Kesselring had wanted to use against Malta, an operation he considered of utmost importance. The pursuit itself was hampered by logistical difficulties, something Kesselring had predicted. The result was a series of significant defeats at the hands of the regrouping Allies. Kesselring's part in the Gazala offensive earned him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, with oak leaves and swords, and he was also considered for a further promotion. Hitler had a great deal of respect for Kesselring, and he considered him as a replacement for Wilhelm Keitel as Chief of Staff at German High Command, but Kesselring's value in the Mediterranean was too great to see him moved away from there. Instead of being promoted off to headquarters, he was given greater power within his area of command, with direct control of all German forces in the Mediterranean theatre, except for the ever-independent Rommel and his troops in the Afrika Korps. In November 1942, an Anglo-American force invaded North Africa, just as Kesselring had predicted. This invasion, named Operation Torch, was the first time the Americans, with their vast economic and manpower resources, had brought troops to the war against Germany, and it did not bode well. The Allies landed in Algeria, trapping the Germans and Italians between these new arrivals in the west and long-standing Allied troops in the east. Hitler called Kesselring directly, ordering him to send all of the troops he could into Tunisia to secure control of bases there. He also ordered Kesselring not to go to Tunisia himself, which hampered him as he was used to taking a direct approach to leadership by going to the front to inspire the troops and observe the situation. For the most part, Kesselring obeyed Hitler's orders, focusing on redirecting all the forces he could into Tunisia, where General Walther Nering followed his commands in the building of a defensive area around the ports of Tunis and Bizerte. Kesselring's efforts paid off, halting the initial advance from the west. Despite the well-equipped formations they faced and the lack of formal structure in the hastily assembled force, the Axis troops held the line and even pushed the Americans and British back in places. Still, two problems remained: Rommel's unreliability and the British-led forces advancing from the east. Kesselring spent Christmas and New Year's with Rommel's troops in the desert. During his tour of inspection, he concluded that morale was still high among German soldiers and that there was no reason they couldn't carry on the fight. The Italians, whose colonies were under threat from the Allied advance, agreed with him, but Rommel had other ideas. He was determined to withdraw into the secure zone in Tunisia, linking up with Nering's forces there. Despite the protests of the Italians and Kesselring, Rommel made his retreat. Having arrived in southern Tunisia, he contributed to the Axis fighting there, giving them some temporary successes. But the Germans and Italians were now contained in an ever-shrinking patch of land. Kesselring ordered an attack led by Rommel in February 1943, leading to a success at Kasserine Pass, but the ground was soon retaken by British and American forces. In May, the Allies launched a final push across Tunisia, and the Germans and Italians were defeated. 230,000 men were taken prisoner, and the Axis armies were driven out of North Africa. Kesselring's grip on the Mediterranean was failing. Italy. With the African coast solidly in their hands, the Allies were free to launch an invasion of southern Europe, and Kesselring, pushed onto the defensive, could only try to predict where that invasion would come, and do his best to prepare for it. The island of Sicily provided a self-contained stepping stone from which the Allies could launch an invasion of the Italian mainland. In addition, fighter planes from Tunisia and Malta would be able to reach Sicilian airspace, providing cover for landings there. All of these factors made Sicily the obvious choice, and Kesselring knew it. He had already sent troops to Sicily during the Tunisian campaign, and now he set about bolstering them. 10 Italian divisions on the island were reinforced by 2 German divisions, which had been rebuilt after being smashed in Tunisia. As part of his plans to counter the invasion, Kesselring sent bombers to attack the North African ports where Allied transport fleets were assembling. It wasn't an effective measure, but it was all he could do to go on the offensive. He also readied submarines to attack Allied ships as they approached Sicily, hoping to put a dent in the invasion fleet before the soldiers could land. Ever the realist, Kesselring knew that there were severe limits to what his forces could do. 12 divisions was enough to prevent the Allies from simply walking into Sicily, but it wouldn't be sufficient to prevent a large and determined invasion force, so he based his strategy on driving them back once they arrived. Colonel Paul Conrad, commander of one of the German divisions on the island, was ordered to counterattack against the Allies as soon as he could tell what their objectives were. Conrad was to do this, regardless of any orders he received from Alfredo Guzzoni, the Italian commander of the forces on the island. The time for the tactful handling of the Italians was almost over. After all, if Italy couldn't be held by the Axis, it didn't matter which side it was on. If the war in the Mediterranean had taught the Germans one thing, it was that they couldn't rely on their allies. On the 10th of July 1943, Allied forces began their invasion of Sicily. German submarines had little success against the invasion fleet, and in the build-up to the attack, the Luftwaffe were forced to retreat to the Italian mainland. But when the ships arrived, the Luftwaffe did their best to stop the landings, sinking an American destroyer and 2 transport ships during the landings. Undeterred, the Allies quickly established a beachhead and set up a perimeter on the east side of the island. Unaware Guzzoni had planned to launch a counterattack the next day, Conrad launched the attack for which he had been prepared by Kesselring, aiming to drive the American forces back before they could unload their tanks and artillery. While the forceful counterattack did damage the American forces, it failed to destroy their vital beachhead. As the Axis troops responded to the invasion, the overlapping responsibilities of the different commanders created a farcical situation that bordered on the disastrous. Aside from Conrad and Guzzoni's uncoordinated counterattacks, Fridolin von Senger, the German officer in charge of ground troops, was issuing different orders from Guzzoni. A lack of proper coordination between Axis forces threatened to make an already difficult situation impossible. Kesselring went to Sicily on the 12th of July with the aim of asserting order over the fighting there and to assess the state of affairs. In particular, he was concerned by reports that some Italians had given up without a fight. Upon discovering the reports were true, he ordered more German troops to the island to compensate. But even with these forces, it was clear the Italian defended west of the island could not be held. Over the next month, Kesselring fought a losing battle against Allied forces advancing across Sicily. He travelled to the island more than once to see the situation firsthand and send in what troops he could spare, including panzers and paratroopers, but his resources were limited. The Allies had the advantage from the start, and it was inevitable that Sicily was going to fall. When it became clear the Axis position on the island was untenable, Kesselring's holding action turned into a fighting retreat. The priority was now to withdraw as much of the German military force as possible from the island before it fell. To do this, he ordered a withdrawal to the north from where the troops could embark. This retreat was the most successful part of Axis operations in Sicily. The Allies had superiority on land, sea, and air, but Kesselring, having overcome his earlier difficulties, was better able to coordinate the different forces serving under him. Over the course of a week, he evacuated 40,000 men, 47 tanks, and 94 artillery pieces, along with their vehicles and thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food. Though he had not held on to Sicily, Kesselring's successful withdrawal had given the Germans more troops with which to defend southern Italy. The next stage in the Allied operation was obvious to everyone, not just Kesselring. Only a narrow strait lay between the Allies and the Italian peninsula, where they were able to hold territory in mainland Western Europe for the first time since 1940. At the same time, the Italians couldn't be relied upon, militarily or politically, to defend themselves. Around this time, the British possessed intelligence, gathered from their ultra-penetration of German codes, that they believed revealed Hitler's intention to abandon Italy and retreat to the northern Alps to form a defensive line should Sicily fall and Anglo-American forces reach the shores of the peninsula itself. While correct at the time, this analysis failed to consider that Hitler's strategy naturally changed as circumstances themselves shifted. As it turned out, the lackluster Allied showing on Sicily and the escape of most of the island's garrison encouraged Hitler to alter his plans and defend Italy vigorously. With its rugged mountain ridges, deep valleys, and numerous rivers, Italy contained tens of thousands of natural defensive positions, and the Germans would exploit these to the fullest during the ensuing campaign, bogging down the Anglo-American armies in an endless series of costly, time-consuming engagements. As Kesselring prepared to fend off Allied forces approaching Italy, there was political trouble behind the scenes. The Italian government, never as staunchly pro-German as Hitler would have liked, had wavered in its allegiance to their cause. Faced with the prospect of defeat and occupation, King Victor Emmanuel sacked and arrested Mussolini, reclaimed the powers given to the dictator, and formed a new government. Summoned to a meeting with the king and Marshal Badoglio, the new Italian prime minister, Kesselring was reassured the Italians would continue to fight on Germany's side. He asked about Mussolini's location on the basis that the former leader was his direct superior, but Badoglio claimed ignorance. Kesselring still believed Italy was worth fighting for, clinging to the hope the Italians might retain their existing alliance. Strategically, he believed it important to retain control of Italy and prevent Allied air raids from reaching Germany, but the Italians were in negotiations with the Allies. On the 3rd of September, they secretly signed an armistice agreement. Meanwhile, Kesselring's fondness for the Italians had undermined Hitler's faith in him, and he was ordered to withdraw from southern Italy to join with Rommel's defense of the north. Kesselring argued against this, going as far as to offer his resignation, but it was not accepted. The Allies landed at the tip of mainland Italy on the 3rd of September. Some Italians welcomed their arrival, while others continued to fight alongside the Germans. A few days later, on the 8th, an Allied air raid hit Kesselring's headquarters, killing nearly 100 people working for him and destroying his communications network. When communications were restored, news came through that the Allies had announced an armistice agreement. Italy, it seemed, was giving up the fight. The Germans had planned for this possibility, and for the likelihood that, having surrendered, the Italian government would soon join the opposing side, so they rushed to disarm and contain the Italian units, both in the peninsula and elsewhere in Europe. Some Italians joined the Germans, while some became prisoners, laboring for former Allies who were now their occupiers. Some were disarmed and sent home, while one Italian commander was shot. On the 12th of September, a daring raid by German commandos retrieved Mussolini from the mountain chalet where he was being held. Hitler created a new state with the former dictator of Italy as a figurehead, called the Italian Social Republic, in the north of the country. It was a puppet state effectively ruled from Germany, one where Mussolini's authority was accepted, largely because of the German troops stationed there. However, far from stabilizing the situation, the Italian Social Republic acted as a spur to drive on Italian anti-German partisans. So as the Allies advanced north, resistance fighters emerged in growing numbers, attacking the Germans and the Italians still fighting on their side. Despite uncertainty in the German hierarchy, Kesselring and Rommel were both briefly given responsibility for holding Italy, but Kesselring managed to cling to his plans to defend the south, rather than simply surrender it to the Allies. He hurried to secure Rome, a symbolically and strategically important point, and then he ordered the 10th Army to hold up the British, who were advancing up the peninsula, while he dealt with American landings around Salerno on the west coast. Kesselring's counterattack, which included a bombing by Luftwaffe 2, his old command, dealt heavy damage to the Americans, who considered evacuating the beaches and giving up on the operation. Ultimately, the Americans clung on and forced their way inland. Over the next year, Kesselring fought delaying actions while constructing a series of defensive lines further and further north. He held up Allied advances at Anzio and Monte Cassino, but he lacked the resources to throw the enemy back. Between fighting on the Eastern Front and preparations to defend against an expected invasion of France, the Germans had been stretched thin, and there were few resources to spare for Italy. As always, Kesselring combined a strategic overview with an awareness of what was happening at the front, and he went to inspect the troops close to the action, bolstering morale and adding to his awareness of the reality of the war. Late in the summer of 1944, the Germans were driven back to the Gothic Line. Constructed along the summits of the northern Apennine Mountains, this was Kesselring's last and best line of defense in Italy. Here, in carefully prepared positions, the Germans held the Allies back through the winter of 1944-45. It was impossible for any officer working for Hitler's regime to stay entirely clear of its brutal methods and hateful attitudes. Though Kesselring was a career soldier rather than an ideologically driven Nazi, his command in Italy implicated him in a series of war crimes. Some of these events happened under his oversight of Italy, but without his involvement, including the execution of a group of captured American soldiers in March 1944, based on Hitler's standing order that any captured Allied commanders be killed. Some of the crimes had been ordered by Hitler and accepted by Kesselring, such as a murderous reprisal against civilians in Rome following an attack on SS police forces in March 1944. Some came from Kesselring's own orders. One such incident occurred in June 1944, when, under pressure from Allied advances, Kesselring allowed the massive use of heavy weaponry against the partisans, promising that soldiers who went past the normal bounds of behavior would not be punished, effectively giving them a free hand to commit atrocities. He did this without having to take responsibility for ordering them himself, and he was quoted as saying, "The partisan situation in the Italian theatre, particularly central Italy, has deteriorated to such an extent that it constitutes a serious danger to troops, supply lines, war industry, and economic potential. The fight against the partisans must be carried out with all means at our disposal and with utmost severity. I will protect any commander who exceeds our usual restraint in the choice of methods in executing one's orders. That is better than failure or neglect to act." Other crimes were simply opportunities he had taken, as was the case in Rome, where Kesselring used Jewish slave labor to construct city defenses. Throughout this time, Kesselring clearly still saw some boundaries with respect to how a soldier should behave. Following a protest from Mussolini in August 1944, he spoke out against German attacks on Italian civilians and began investigations into these incidents. When ordered to deport the Roman Jews to Germany, he refused, using a lack of resources as his justification, and the task of deporting them was given to the SS. Regardless, Kesselring had crossed lines that most of the world considered unacceptable, and these actions would come back to haunt him after the war. As he struggled to hold Italy, Kesselring rushed troops back and forth across the country. He himself spent a lot of time traveling from one place to another, trying to keep control of the war. In the process of holding the Allies at the Gothic Line on the 25th of October 1944, Kesselring was injured in a car crash when his vehicle hit an artillery piece on the road. He suffered serious injuries to his head and face, and was out of action for 3 months while he recovered. When he returned, Kesselring resumed his frontline visits, and his work strengthening the defenses of the Gothic Line. But by then, the face of the war had changed. The Allies had liberated France, and were pushing into Germany, where Kesselring would see out the final months of the war. American General Mark Clark summed up what many of the Allies in Italy must have thought when news broke that Kesselring was leaving the theatre. Furthermore, we knew that in command of these forces was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of the ablest officers in the Hitler armies. He had served with distinction in the German artillery and the Air Force, and had been on the general staff prior to the war. Kesselring was well qualified, both as a commander and an administrator, and he had conducted the Axis operations in Italy with great skill for 2 years, after which he was transferred to the Western Front in Germany. I was glad to see him go. He was quick to reorganize his forces and shift reserves to meet our attacks. The fall of Germany. On the 9th of March 1945, Kesselring was summoned to see Hitler, who gave him one last impossible task. Kesselring was made Supreme Commander West, responsible for overseeing German efforts to halt Allied forces advancing from France into Germany. Kesselring tried to turn down the post, saying he had not entirely recovered from the crash the previous autumn, but once again Hitler knew what he wanted and would not take no for an answer. Hitler claimed conditions in the army on the Western Front were good, and Kesselring, whose optimism Hitler had valued in the past, believed in his leader's appraisal. He set out to hold the West while Hitler achieved the great victory he had predicted in the East, which would serve to free up more troops for Kesselring. Even by Hitler's standards, it was an unrealistic assessment. Soviet troops were approaching Berlin, and Germany had spent the last of its reserves in a failed attempt to beat the Allies in the Ardennes the previous December. Nevertheless, Kesselring went to his new command post in apparently high spirits, determined to halt the Allies in their tracks. When the new commander arrived, the officers he met tried to inform him about the reality of the situation, but Kesselring was unwilling to reject Hitler's understanding of the war, having seen no evidence of the situation being worse than his leader had said. As it became clear there were serious problems on the Western Front, Kesselring criticized General Walter Model and the commanders who had led operations on the front, as well as the operations recently carried out by Army Group B under Model's command. Model raged against the attitudes of the German High Command, and he and Kesselring got into a blazing argument. It was not an auspicious start to Kesselring's new role, to say the least. When he visited army posts near the front, Kesselring received similar assessments. According to those at the front, current positions could not be held, the situation was desperate, and if he had asked these men to continue as they were, their forces would surely be destroyed. Kesselring ordered them to hold. Hitler had a history of reshuffling his armies in times of crisis, rearranging command posts, and reorganizing units to make the situation look better than it was, and as Germany crumbled, this habit of rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship reached new heights. Kesselring was made Supreme Commander South as Germany was split in two by the Allied advance. Once again, he had gained fresh responsibilities at a time when any attempt to assert command would have been a struggle. Kesselring's command was crumbling, along with the rest of the Reich. One of the areas under his leadership was the last German territory on the west bank of the Rhine, a triangle of territory around the Saar. High Command had ordered that this territory should be held, an order passed on to Kesselring's officers. Then came the American armies, one of them led by the famously aggressive General George S. Patton. The Germans suffered heavy casualties, and their defensive line crumbled. As the losses rose into the tens of thousands, Hitler finally accepted a withdrawal. Through a skillfully delaying action, the Germans managed to pull back across the Rhine, avoiding being encircled and forced to surrender. But they had lost over 100,000 men at a time where there were no fresh troops to be had. In April, Model's army group met a similar fate. Surrounded in the Ruhr region, the heart of industrial Germany, they were overwhelmed by the advancing Americans. The army was surrounded, but Model refused to surrender. He would walk off into the forest to commit suicide rather than accept defeat, and his army was destroyed. Of course, Model wasn't the only one to choose suicide over defeat. Hitler killed himself in his bunker in Berlin on the 30th of April, and with that, the man whose orders Kesselring had worked so hard to obey was gone. Piece by piece, the German armies started to surrender. Even before Hitler's death, German forces in Italy had offered their surrender to the Allies, an action that infuriated Kesselring, who, as their supreme commander, had ordered them to fight on. Though he had been aware of secret negotiations taking place behind the scenes since March, he had not given permission for negotiators to agree to the surrender. Finally, on the 2nd of May, Kesselring was convinced, following a long phone conversation with one of the German negotiators. Hitler was gone, Germany was falling, and all he could do was arrange the best possible end for the troops serving under him. For those fighting in the East, this meant avoiding being captured by the Soviets, as everybody expected better treatment if they fell into American or British hands. Some even thought the Western Allies might bring Germany onto their side to fight against the communist menace that was the USSR. At a meeting of troop commanders in Austria and neighboring regions, Kesselring chaired discussions over how best to protect their men. Plans were made for withdrawals to the west, with some troops holding in place so that others could retreat. Meanwhile, the German government was establishing peace terms with the Allies, which limited how much time Kesselring had to get his men away from the Soviet Red Army. On the 9th of May 1945, Kesselring surrendered. Arriving in a column of cars decked out with white flags, he and his command group reached the American 101st Airborne Division. Kesselring had grasped the reality of defeat, but not how far this would remove him from power. He initially refused to surrender to the 101st, as no one there was his equal in rank. Nonetheless, Kesselring was treated with respect by the Americans. They let him retain his Field Marshal's baton and give interviews to the press. Photos of him drinking tea with American General Maxwell Taylor were published. Such treatment perhaps bolstered Kesselring's optimistic view of the situation, leading to a strange request when he asked to be given a plane to fly to Yugoslavia to oversee the German evacuation there. This request made perfect sense to Kesselring because the Yugoslavians were set on vengeance against the Germans, and any troops they captured could expect brutal treatment. They needed to be brought out if they were to be saved from a barbarous end. Given the chaos that had descended upon the region and his role as Supreme Commander South, Kesselring was the perfect man for the job. Surely the Americans could see this was simply a matter of completing the surrender and saving lives. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied Commander-in-Chief, rejected the idea, as well as Kesselring's request to set up a communications network to help bring the surrendering German armies home. It was a stark reminder that the Americans weren't there to help the Germans, but to bring an end to their hideous regime. After the war, a military leader often faces a situation he has to deal with, but because it is his duty, no court can try him. Kesselring. Following the war, the British arranged a series of war crimes trials in Italy run by the British military in conjunction with the Italians. Kesselring was put on trial in 1947 on 2 counts: the massacre of hundreds of civilians in March 1944 and incitement to kill other Italian civilians. Given that his signature had appeared on orders proclaiming German reprisals, his punishment was important as a symbol of the German Reich, as it was due to his own behavior. Kesselring did not use the same defense as other Nazis. Instead of claiming he was simply obeying orders, he argued that his actions had been entirely legal, but not surprisingly, the court did not agree. In May 1947, he was sentenced to death by firing squad. Though the decision was the work of a British military court, it incited protests from British and American commanders and politicians who had led the fight against Kesselring. He was still widely respected, and they considered it an unjust punishment. Furthermore, the Italian government refused to carry out the punishment because they had gotten rid of capital punishment, strongly associated with the brutality of Mussolini's fascist regime in 1944. Kesselring's sentence was commuted to life in prison as a result, and he spent the next 5 years as a prisoner in Germany under British supervision. In the early months of his confinement, he was approached by a former SS officer who invited Kesselring to be part of an escape he was planning, but Kesselring refused, saying that he saw escape as a confession of guilt. While in prison, Kesselring worked on a history of the Second World War for the U.S. Army, and on his memoirs, which would later be published in secret. In both Germany and Britain, pressure mounted to release Kesselring and some other prisoners. It was an awkward political situation, one that threatened Britain's reputation and the rebuilding of West Germany as an ally in the Cold War. A way out emerged in 1952 when Kesselring was diagnosed with throat cancer. Given the attention on his case, the British didn't want him dying in prison, and so he was released. As it turned out, the throat cancer did not take Kesselring, and he spent the last few years as a free man and something of a celebrity, getting involved with veterans groups, giving interviews to the press, publishing his memoirs, and writing another book reflecting on the war. He also appeared as an expert witness in other people's war crimes trials. Kesselring never accepted that any of his actions had been wrong, preferring to believe he had been doing his duty as a soldier. Kesselring died of a heart attack on the 16th of July 1960. Veterans attended his funeral and spoke fondly of him. He remained a divisive figure to the end, a man loved by his troops, but rejected by a reformed German establishment, one that saw his actions in Italy as murderous atrocities. In the end, being an effective leader did not preclude the fact that he could also be a war criminal. That was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, The Life and Legacy of Nazi Germany's Most Popular Commander, by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Colin Fluxman. Copyright 2017 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright 2017 by Charles River Editors.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.